The morning Anna Bailey stole oats from a dead man's barn was the morning she decided she was done being ashamed of surviving. She had not meant for it to become a habit. That was what she told herself each time she crept across the frost-stiffened grass before the sun had fully risen over the flat line of the Kansas horizon, her breath making small ghosts in the cold November air of 1878. She told herself she would do it once, maybe twice, and then she would find another way. She would move on. She would figure something out. That was what women like her did, women who had been left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stubbornness so deep it had calcified into something like courage. The ranch sat about a quarter-mile north of the abandoned soddy she had taken shelter in. She had found the soddy in late October, when the nights were turning mean, and the wind off the plains carried a bite that promised worse to come. The earthen walls were crumbling at the corners, and a family of mice had long since claimed the back half, but the roof held and the door still swung on its leather hinges, and when Anna pulled her thin wool coat tight around herself and lay down on the dirt floor, she felt something she had not felt in weeks, which was safety. She had arrived in Comanche County on foot, which told its own story. She had come from Dodge City, walking south and west along the wagon road, carrying nothing but a canvas sack with a spare dress, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and about $4.30 that she had saved in the lining of her boot over the course of a year of working in a boarding house. She had left the boarding house because the man who owned it, a thick-necked widower named Harold Crest, had decided that Anna's presence under his roof entitled him to more than her labor. She had left in the middle of the night. She had not looked back. She was 24 years old and she had been on her own since she was 19, which was when her father had died of a fever that swept through their homestead in Missouri and took him and her younger brother Thomas within the same week. Her mother had been gone since Anna was 11. There were no aunts or uncles she could call on. There was only the road and her own 2 feet and the stubborn, iron-core knowledge that she was going to survive this, whatever this happened to be on any given day. What it was in November of 1878 was hunger. She had spent her $4.30 on a bag of cornmeal, some dried beans, a small piece of salt pork, and a pair of wool stockings by the time she reached the soddy. She had made the food last with the kind of miserly discipline that only someone who has truly known scarcity can manage, but by the first week of November it was nearly gone. The cornmeal was down to a scraping at the bottom of the sack. The beans were finished. She had been living on weak cornbread and water for 4 days, and her hands had started to tremble when she lifted things. It was on the 5th morning that she had wandered far enough north to see the ranch. It was a proper spread, not large by Texas standards, maybe, but solid and well kept in the way that spoke of a man who took his work seriously. There was a main house built of timber, unusual for the plains where wood cost money and sod was free, which told her the owner was doing reasonably well. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a water trough, a smokehouse, and a corral where a single big roan horse stood watching her with an expression of patient intelligence she found immediately sympathetic. The horse was the reason she went back. She had been walking past, keeping to the edge of the property, when the roan had lifted his great head and looked at her with dark liquid eyes that held something she could only describe as recognition, though that made no logical sense. He nickered softly. She stopped. She had always loved horses, had grown up around them on the Missouri homestead, and something about the sound of his greeting cracked open a small piece of the loneliness she had been carrying. She went to the fence. She let him sniff her hand. He was a fine animal, maybe 16 hands, well-muscled and glossy, but she could see from the way he nosed at the empty corner of the corral that someone had been careless about his morning feeding. The water trough was also getting low, and the gate latch was hanging loose, one good wind from letting him wander. She did not think about it too long because she had learned that thinking too long about things led to talking yourself out of what needed to be done. She went into the barn, found the oat barrel, and gave the horse his morning feed. She filled the trough from the pump in the yard. She fixed the gate latch with a length of wire she found coiled on a fence post. And then she saw the oat barrel again, and she thought about her empty canvas sack, and she did something she was not entirely proud of, which was to scoop out a double handful and pour it into the sack and carry it back to the soddy with her. She ate it boiled with a pinch of salt, and it was the best thing she had tasted in a week. After that, she told herself she was trading. She was not stealing. She was doing work that needed doing and taking a modest payment for it. Every morning before light she made the walk north, tended the horse, checked the gate, and took a small measure of oats or occasionally an egg from the chicken coop that she was reasonably certain the owner would not miss. She kept everything else in order. She noticed that the owner was clearly single, or at least alone, because there was only one horse, and the breakfast fire she sometimes saw smoking from the chimney came late in the mornings, suggesting a man without a family schedule to keep. She never saw him. She was meticulous about that. She arrived in the gray dark before sunrise, and she was gone before the smoke started from the chimney. She thought of herself as a ghost, useful and invisible, which was a kind of existence she had grown familiar with over the years. She did not know that she was leaving tracks. Roscoe Vaughn had come to Comanche County in 1875, 3 years before Anna arrived, and he had built his ranch on a piece of land that the Homestead Act technically promised to anyone willing to prove up on it, which he had done with considerable effort and no small amount of sweat. He was 31 years old in that November of 1878, a lean, weathered man with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, which he thought made him look older than he was, and which most people who met him thought suited him perfectly. He had gray eyes the color of a winter sky before snow, and a quiet manner that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and which was actually just the particular stillness of a man who had learned to listen before he spoke. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee, which explained the slight softness at the edges of his words when he chose to use them, which was not often. He lived alone by choice, or at least by the particular kind of choice that happens when a man buries his wife, and decides that the safest thing for his heart is to pour everything into the land and the animals, and the simple, manageable work of keeping things alive. His wife Clara had died in the spring of 1876, not long after they had settled the ranch. She had died of a fever that the doctor in the nearest town had not been able to name or stop. She was 27. They had been married 4 years. He did not speak about it to anyone, not because he was ashamed or broken, though he had been both for a time, but because grief was a private country and he had learned to live there quietly. The horse's name was Scout, and Roscoe knew Scout's feeding schedule better than he knew almost anything else in his life, which was why he noticed on the 6th morning that Scout had been fed before Roscoe got to the barn. He stood in the barn doorway with his bucket in his hand and looked at Scout, who was contentedly working through a pile of oats with the focused satisfaction of an animal with no philosophical concerns, and Roscoe thought, now that is peculiar. He checked the oat barrel. It was slightly lower than it should have been. He checked the water trough and found it full, which it should not have been at that hour. He walked the fence line and found the gate latch newly wired, neater than the rough fix he had been meaning to make for 2 weeks. He went back inside and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the gray November morning and thought about who in this wide, empty country might have reason to be tending another man's horse before sunrise. The next morning he got up earlier. He was dressed and in the barn by 4 in the morning, sitting in the dark on a hay bale with a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold, waiting. He was a patient man. He had sat in worse places for longer. He heard her before he saw her. Soft footsteps in the yard, lighter than a man's, deliberate in the way of someone accustomed to moving quietly. Then the creak of the barn door and the gray shape of a woman stepping into the dimness, moving directly to Scout's stall with the confidence of someone who had done this before, which she had. He did not say anything. He watched her fill the feed bucket, watched the way she stroked Scout's nose with a familiarity that told him this was not a stranger to horses. She was thin, painfully so, even under the bulky coat. He could see it in the way her wrists looked too narrow when she lifted the bucket, in the hollowness of her cheeks when she turned slightly and the faint pre-dawn light from the door found her face. She was young, he thought. Not a girl, but young. He watched her go to the oat barrel. He watched her look at it for a moment. He watched her take out a small canvas sack from inside her coat, and he watched her stop, the sack in her hand, and he thought she was going to take some, but she held completely still for a long moment, almost like she was arguing with herself, and then she put the sack back inside her coat without taking anything. That was the thing that made up his mind, not the tending. Not the tracks she had been leaving in the frost every morning that he had followed 2 days ago back to the abandoned soddy, had stood outside in the cold dark and looked at the thin thread of smoke coming from inside, had felt something complicated move through him. It was the choosing not to take when she so clearly needed to, when she was so clearly hungry that the decision cost her something visible. That was the thing. He set down the cold coffee tin. "Morning," he said. She spun around. Even in the dim light he could see the terror that crossed her face, that particular animal terror of someone who has been surviving on the margins and knows how quickly the margins can turn against you. She backed up one step, too, and her eyes went to the barn door calculating the distance. "I'm not going to stop you leaving," he said, keeping his voice level and unhurried, the way he talked to Scout when the horse was spooked. "But I would like it if you did not." She had stopped backing up. She was watching him with those large, dark eyes, and the expression on her face was not quite terror anymore, but it was still a long way from calm. "I have not taken anything," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, and it told him she was making an effort to sound unafraid. "I have fed your horse and fixed your gate, and I have not taken anything." "This morning you have not," he said, "but that is not why I am here. I am here because I have been watching and I know what I see, and what I see is a woman who is hungry." She lifted her chin. "That is none of your business." "Maybe not," he said. He stood up from the hay bale slowly, making sure none of his movements were sudden or threatening. "But I have a fire going in the house, and I have a side of bacon and eggs from the coop and biscuits that are not going to bake themselves. And I would consider it a kindness if you would come and eat." The silence between them was enormous. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie with a low, constant sound like breathing. Scout shifted his weight and blew softly through his nose. "Why?" she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a challenge. It was the word of someone who had learned to look for the trap. "Because you are hungry," he said simply, "and I have food. And whatever else is true about this world, that particular arithmetic seems straightforward to me." She looked at him for a long time. He did not rush it. He stood with his hands at his sides and let her look. "Anna," she said finally. "My name is Anna Bailey." "Roscoe Vaughn," he said. He did not extend his hand because that seemed like it might crowd her. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Bailey. Will you come eat?" She came. She sat at his kitchen table with her back straight and her hands folded, and she ate with the careful, measured restraint of someone who has gone without long enough to know that eating too fast when you are starving will make you sick. He noticed this and did not comment on it. He simply put things on the table and refilled her plate when it was empty and drank his coffee and looked mostly at his own food. The kitchen was plain and clean and warm. There was a cast iron stove that radiated a wonderful heat, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a shelf of supplies, and a window that faced east and was currently showing them the first long fingers of winter sunrise spreading pink and orange across the flat Kansas sky. It was, Anna thought, a very good window to have a kitchen table in front of. "You live here alone," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "How long?" "Since 1875, 3 years." She looked at the second chair, which had a slight layer of dust on the seat that the other one did not. He saw her look. "I lost my wife," he said. It came out straightforwardly, not fishing for sympathy, just stating a fact so she would not have to wonder about it. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in the sincere and uncomplicated way of someone who knows what loss looks like from the inside. "Thank you," he said. They were quiet for a little while. She ate another biscuit. He refilled her coffee, which she accepted with both hands wrapped around the mug in the way of someone who had been cold for a long time. "I am not a thief," she said eventually. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "I was going to pay it back when I had something to pay with." "I know that too," he said, and he said it with enough plain conviction that she looked up at him, and he met her eyes, and something in the look held for just a moment, just a breath longer than practical, before they both looked away. She told him a little about herself, not everything, but enough. About Dodge City and the boarding house and the long walk south. She was precise and unemotional in the telling, the way people are when they have processed something but are still wary of other people's reactions to it. He listened without interrupting, which was the best thing he could have done. "Where are you going?" he asked when she was finished. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cold wind shook the wooden shutters. "I am not entirely sure," she said, which was the honest answer. He nodded. "Winter is coming on hard this year," he said. "They say it will be one of the bad ones." "I have a soddy," she said. "I have been in that soddy," he said. "Last 2 winters the north wall let in water when the snow melted. You will freeze." She looked at him steadily. "What are you suggesting?" He turned his coffee mug between his hands and seemed to be choosing his words with some care. "I have a tack room off the barn that I do not use. It is warm, it is dry, and it has a bolt on the inside. I am suggesting that you stay there until spring, or until you find where you are going, whichever comes first." The offer hung in the air between them. Anna Bailey had learned to be careful about men who offered things. She had learned this the hard way in ways she did not discuss. She sat across from this quiet man with his winter sky eyes, and she tried to read him the way she had learned to read people, quickly and accurately, the way survival requires. What she read was not nothing. What she read was a man who was lonely in the deep, self-contained way of someone who has decided loneliness is safer than risk, but who had a fundamental decency that seemed to come from somewhere so far inside him it was essentially structural, like a beam in a house. It was not something he was performing. It was simply something he was. "I would work," she said. "I would not take charity. If I stay, I work for what I eat." "I was not offering charity," he said. "I was offering a fair exchange. There is more work on a ranch than one man can keep up with in winter, and you have already demonstrated you can handle a horse." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape of one. "All right," she said. "I accept." She moved into the tack room that afternoon. It was small, but as he had said, it was warm and dry, being nestled into the south-facing side of the barn with the shared wall holding heat from the animals. She had a cot, a small lantern, a bucket for washing, and the bolt on the door, which she used every night and which he never once tested or questioned or commented on. The first week was careful and formal. They established a rhythm without speaking about it much. She rose early and tended to Scout and the chickens before he was up. He made breakfast, large enough for 2, which she found waiting for her when she came in. She learned where things were kept. She started taking on the cooking at midday, and he ate what she made without complaining, and complimented what deserved complimenting in a direct, factual way that she appreciated more than she would have appreciated elaborate praise. He spent his days working the land or tending fences or riding out to check on the property's corners, and she kept the house and the livestock, and began patching and mending the various small things around the property that had been accumulating since Clara's death: the torn feed bags, the loose hinge on the chicken coop, the gaps in the window caulking that let the cold air seep in. He came home one evening in the second week and found her up on a ladder resealing the gap between the window frame and the wall on the north side of the house, and he stood in the yard and looked up at her. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You were losing heat through there. I could feel it every time I walked past that wall." She pressed another handful of the clay and straw mixture she had mixed into the gap and smoothed it flat with her palm. "It will be dry by morning." He stood there for another moment. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice that had more layers to it than the simple words suggested, something that acknowledged not just the window but all of it, the choosing to stay and work and make things better. "You do not need to thank me," she said without looking down from the ladder. "It is fair exchange." But she was smiling as she said it, and after a moment she heard him chuckle, soft and low, and when she looked down he was smiling too, for just a second before he caught himself, and the smile did something remarkable to his face, softening all the careful lines. She thought about that smile for a while after he went inside. She looked out her tack room window at the cold stars over the Kansas plain and told herself firmly to stop thinking about it. By the third week of November, the first serious snow had come, and they were spending more time indoors. He played chess in the evenings, she discovered, poorly and without apparent awareness of how poorly, and she had learned the game from her father and was considerably better at it than she let on, winning enough to make it interesting and losing enough to keep him from feeling discouraged. They played by lamplight at the kitchen table and drank coffee and spoke about things cautiously at first, and then with gradually increasing ease, the way conversation loosens when people are occupied with something else, and their guard drops by increments. She learned that he had grown up on a tobacco farm in Tennessee, middle of 5 children, and had come west because the West offered something the East had already parceled up, which was land that was yours and the sense of possibility that came with it. He spoke about his family in Tennessee with warmth but without homesickness, the comfortable distance of a man who knows where he belongs now. He had a brother named James who sent letters every few months, and a sister named Alina who had married a schoolteacher in Nashville and produced 4 children whom Roscoe had never met in person but had received detailed written reports about. He was funny, she discovered. Not in an obvious way, not a man who told jokes, but dry and precise in his observations. A kind of humor that appeared so unexpectedly that when it landed it was twice as effective for the surprise of it. She would be saying something ordinary, and he would add a single sentence with a perfectly straight face, and she would find herself laughing before she had quite registered what was funny. A real laugh, unstudied and unguarded, and she would look up and find him watching her laugh with that contained expression that she was beginning to understand was his version of delight. He learned that she read, which he had not expected, and that she read seriously and thoughtfully and had opinions about what she read. He had a small shelf of books in the main room, mostly practical, a farming almanac, a Bible, a couple of dime novels left by a hand he had employed briefly the previous summer. But there was also a volume of Emerson essays and a copy of Great Expectations, and when she found the Dickens one morning while he was out and settled herself by the stove to read it, she was still there 2 hours later when he came in for the midday meal, deeply absorbed, and when she finally looked up she went slightly pink as if caught in some private indulgence. "Take it," he said. "I should be working," she said. "The work will be there," he said. "Take it." She read it in 4 days. She told him what she thought about it in the precise and engaged way of someone who had been waiting for a person to talk to about books, and he listened and pushed back on a couple of points not because he had read the novel recently, but because he remembered it well enough, and because there was something about watching her argue for a position that lit her up in a way that nothing else quite had yet, her dark eyes sharp and certain and alive with conviction. December came in cold and bright, and the prairie around them was white and flat and infinite and beautiful in the way that beautiful things with no mercy tend to be. The nearest town was Coldwater, about 8 miles south, and Roscoe made the drive once in the first week of December with the wagon to pick up supplies and post some correspondence. He asked her if she wanted to come, and she hesitated. "I will stay and tend things," she said. He understood without asking. A woman alone in a small western town attracted attention that was not always comfortable, and he did not press her. He came back that afternoon with the supplies, and also, she noticed when he began unloading, a small paper-wrapped parcel that he set on the kitchen table without explanation. When she opened it that evening, she found a copy of David Copperfield, also Dickens, and a small bag of peppermint candy. There was no note. He was in the barn when she found it, and she stood in the kitchen holding the book and looking at the candy for a long moment, feeling something shift quietly in her chest, something she had been keeping very carefully latched that seemed to have come open on its own. She put the candy in the pocket of her dress and went back to making supper. She made a venison stew that night with the side of venison he had in the smokehouse, with onions and dried herbs and the good stock she had been building for days. She made sourdough bread, something she had started working on in the first week and had by now perfected to his considerable approval. She set the table with the two mismatched plates and the dented tin cups, and when he came in from the barn and washed up and sat down and looked at what was in front of him, he was quiet for a moment. "This is the best meal I have had in about 2 years," he said. "It is just stew," she said. "It is not just stew," he said. In that level way he had of meaning what he said without decoration, and she looked at her plate and felt the warmth climb her neck and was grateful the lamp was turned low. After supper he suggested chess, but she produced the peppermint candy from her pocket and set it between them on the table and looked at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who had appeared out of his pre-dawn barn like something between a mystery and a miracle, who had taken his worn and somewhat hollow house and filled it with warmth and order and the sound of her voice and her laughter and the smell of real cooking, and he felt something move through him that he recognized from a long time ago and had not expected to feel again. He did not say any of that. He was not built for saying that kind of thing without significant preparation. "It is fair exchange," he said, and let the corner of his mouth lift just slightly, quoting her words back to her. She laughed. There it was, that laugh, and he watched it with everything he had while pretending to look at the chess board. Christmas that year fell on a Wednesday. She had not thought much about it, had spent the last several Christmases alone, and had developed a kind of willful indifference to the holiday that was partly self-protection. But on the morning of Christmas Eve, Roscoe came into the kitchen while she was making breakfast and set a small pine branch on the table, just a branch, cut from one of the small trees along the creek bed, and tied with a length of red ribbon that he must have had stored away somewhere. "I know it is not much," he said, almost as if he was apologizing, and the almost embarrassment on his face was so uncharacteristic and so unexpectedly endearing that she had to look very quickly at the eggs she was scrambling. "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. They had Christmas dinner together at the kitchen table. She had used some of the special stores, the good flour and the dried fruit and the extra sugar, and made something close to a plum pudding, not exactly right without the brandy, but close enough. He contributed a bottle of whiskey that he had been keeping on a high shelf, and they had a small careful amount of it with their coffee after dinner, and she felt the warmth of it settle into her bones alongside the other warmth that had nothing to do with alcohol. "Tell me about Missouri," he said. "When you were small." She told him. She told him about her father's farm, the smell of the turned earth in spring, and the way the fireflies came up out of the fields in June like sparks shaken from a fire. She told him about her brother Thomas, who had been 12 when he died, and who had been building a model steam engine out of scrap wood and wire, who had been the funniest person she had ever known, funnier than anyone, and who had been gone for 5 years now, and whom she still missed in the sharp, specific way of someone who should have had more time. Roscoe listened. He did not offer the well-intentioned but often unhelpful consolations that people sometimes offered. He just listened, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." She looked at the table. The warmth in her chest had become something more tender and more dangerous, and she breathed through it carefully. "He was," she said. "He really was." She glanced up and found him looking at her with those gray eyes that were not cold at all, that had never been cold, and for a moment there was simply the two of them in the warm kitchen with the small pine branch on the table and the wind pressing at the walls outside and the whole long winter in front of them, and nothing felt provisional or frightening. It felt in that moment like exactly where she was meant to be. She looked away first. Old habit. January hit the Kansas plains like a punishment. The temperature dropped to levels that made the house creak at night and frosted the inside of the windows and turned the water in the wash basin to ice before morning. Roscoe spent long, cold hours keeping the animals alive and checking the structures for damage. And Anna developed a system of keeping the house warm, banked fires and sealed drafts and hot bricks wrapped in cloth for the beds. And together they managed, which was more than a lot of homesteads in Comanche County could say that winter. They had settled into a closeness that neither of them had named. They sat near each other in the evenings without needing to fill every silence. She knew how he took his coffee, and he knew that she was unreasonably cheerful in the mornings and markedly quieter in the late afternoons, and that this was just her nature and required no comment. He knew that she sometimes took her Bible to bed, and that the pages were soft and worn from years of handling. And she knew that he sometimes stood outside at night and looked at the stars for a while before coming in, and that this was not melancholy but a kind of private communion with the size of things. On a night in mid-January, a storm came in with almost no warning. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind went from a steady blow to something that felt structural, pressing against the house like a living thing trying to get in. Roscoe came in from the barn in the early evening with ice in his hair and on his coat, and his face had a grim, set look. "It is bad," he said. "Scout is as tight as I can get him. The chickens have the heat lamp, but it is going to be a long night." She had already moved the extra blankets into the main room and had the fire burning as high as she safely dared. She had a pot of coffee on, and she pressed a cup into his hands when he came through the door. He stood in the kitchen doorway thawing, his color coming back, and she was at the stove stirring the oatmeal she had started because it would hold heat and fill him up, and because she found that feeding him well had become one of the things she did in the same way she breathed, without thinking too hard about why. "How long have you been doing this alone?" she asked. She had not meant to ask it. It came out. He was quiet for a moment. "3 winters," he said. "That is a long time." "It is," he said. He sat down at the table. The storm pressed at the windows and the lamplight moved. "It gets easier. Not the way people mean when they say that, not better exactly, just more familiar." She set the oatmeal in front of him. She sat across from him. "I know," she said simply. He looked at her. The storm howled outside. Inside was warmth and the smell of coffee and the quiet presence of another person who knew exactly what she meant. "Anna," he said. He said her name, and then he seemed to think better of whatever he had been about to say, and he looked at his oatmeal. "Say it," she said. He looked up. Whatever he saw in her face must have been enough, because he put down his spoon and he said, "I have been trying to work out how to say this properly, and I am not sure I know how, but I think I should say it plainly, because you deserve plain speaking more than you deserve polished speeches." She waited. Her heart was beating harder than was reasonable. "I like having you here," he said. "I like it more than I have liked most things in a long time. And it is not only because you make better biscuits than I do, and you know how to handle Scout. It is because of who you are, which is the most specific and clearly determined person I have met in a long time, and because you make this house feel like what it was supposed to be, which it did not feel like for 2 years before you came." He stopped. He was looking at the table now. "I am not asking you anything. I know you came here because you needed somewhere safe to be, and I do not want to make you feel that has changed. I just wanted you to know." Anna Bailey, who had been calm in the face of hardship and steady in the face of loss, and level-headed in the face of all manner of difficulty for the better part of 5 years, felt her eyes sting. She stood up. She walked around the table. He looked up at her, wary and uncertain in a way she found almost unbearable. She sat down in the chair next to his instead of across from him, pulling it close, and she put her hand over his on the table. His hand was large and rough and warm, and it turned over very slowly under hers and held it. "I stopped thinking of this as somewhere safe to be," she said quietly. "Somewhere along the way I started thinking of it as home. And I was not sure what to do with that, because I have not had a home in a long time." He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and there was something in them so open and careful and hoping that it took her breath. "Maybe it can be," he said, "if you want it to be." The storm beat at the walls all night, but inside the kitchen was warm and bright, and they sat together at the table and talked until very late. Not about plans or practicalities yet, but simply talking, filling in all the places they had been careful around, laughing sometimes, quiet sometimes. And she fell asleep briefly in her chair and woke up with her cheek against his shoulder and found his arm carefully around her, and the fire burned low and the storm easing outside, and she did not move away. She simply put her hand back over his and went back to sleep. February brought a thaw and then another freeze, and then a thaw that stuck. The plains showed a tentative, cautious green along the creek bed, and the days got longer by increments that you had to look for carefully but were there. Anna had begun doing the bookkeeping for the ranch, at his request, because he confessed with some embarrassment that numbers after a certain point became a philosophical rather than practical exercise for him. And she had taken to the ledger books with considerable competence, finding an orderliness in them that satisfied something in her. She also began a kitchen garden in the second week of February, which he watched with a quiet interest from the window as he had his morning coffee. She had staked it out behind the south-facing side of the house where the soil would warm fastest, and she went into Coldwater with him on his next supply run, and spent a modest amount of her own carefully preserved money on seed packets, beans and squash and carrots, and some tomato seeds she was warned were a gamble this far west. "I am a gambling woman," she told the clerk, and then corrected herself. "I am a gambling woman when the odds are good." She came out of the store to find Roscoe at the wagon talking with the town sheriff, a heavy-set man named Cal Briggs, whom she had not previously met. She came up beside the wagon, and the sheriff looked at her with the frank, assessing look of a man whose job was to know strangers. "This is Miss Bailey," Roscoe said. "She has been working the ranch with me this winter." Something in the way he said it made the sheriff nod with a particularly knowing air, and Anna felt her face warm, and she thought that small towns in 1879 Kansas had opinions about women living on ranches with unmarried men, and that those opinions were probably being fully exercised behind Cal Briggs' carefully neutral expression. "Pleased," the sheriff said. "Likewise," she said, and looked at Roscoe. On the drive home, after a while, he said, "I know people talk." "I know they do," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It might have bothered me more 6 months ago," she said. "Now I care rather less about the opinion of people who do not know either of us." He nodded slowly. The horses moved through the late winter landscape. The sky was enormous and pale blue and enormous above them. "I have been thinking," he said, and then he was quiet for a long moment while she waited, having learned that when he said this it was worth waiting for. "About what comes next, for you, for us." "Us," she said softly, testing the word. "If you want that word," he said. "I do," she said. He looked ahead at the road, and she could see the muscles in his jaw work slightly the way they did when he was working out how to say something that mattered to him. "I think I am asking you something," he said. "Something more specific than last January when I said I was not asking you anything. I have given it considerable thought through the rest of the winter, and I think that the conclusion I keep arriving at is the same one, which is that I would like very much for you to stay. Not in the tack room." He paused. "I am asking poorly. I know I am asking poorly. I would like to do this correctly, which means I should ask you to marry me in a manner that is more appropriate than a wagon seat on a frozen road, but I find I cannot wait until I have worked out a better setting." She was looking at him. Her throat was tight. "Roscoe," she said. "I know it is a lot to ask," he said. "You have your own plans wherever you were going when winter stopped you here, and I do not want to presume that—" "Roscoe," she said again. He stopped. He looked at her. "I was not going anywhere," she said. "I had not been going anywhere for a while. I had been hoping you would say this is what I had been doing." She laughed, a little unsteadily. "I had been trying very hard to be practical about it, and to not presume anything, but I have been hoping you would say something like this for quite some time." The silence that followed was the best kind, full and warm and carrying in it the weight of everything that had been building since a gray November morning when he had said morning from a hay bale in the dark and changed both their lives. He took her hand. They were coming up on the ranch road, and Scout's twin, the second horse he used for wagon work, blew steam from his nose in the cold air, and the early spring sky stretched enormous and luminous above the flat land. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He smiled. Not the half-contained, careful smile she had seen glimpses of all winter, but a full one, sudden and warm and real, and it rearranged his whole face into something that made her heart do something complicated. "Obviously," he repeated, and squeezed her hand. They were married in April, when the Kansas spring had made the prairie into something almost extravagant with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and purple asters, and the small yellow flowers she did not know the names of that came up along the creek bed in thick, cheerful bunches. They were married by a traveling pastor who came through Coldwater once a month, and who read the words in the plain and genuine way of a man who believed them. Sheriff Cal Briggs came, having clearly revising his opinion of the situation, and brought his wife Martha, who was a small, vigorous woman who immediately liked Anna Bailey with a wholehearted decisiveness that was characteristic of her. There were perhaps 10 people in attendance. The ceremony was in the yard of the ranch, which Anna had decorated with what wildflowers she could gather, tied in bunches to the fence posts with strips of white muslin. Roscoe wore his good suit, which was slightly too large and which he wore with the particular stiff dignity of a man who had not put on a suit in some time and was making a good faith effort. She wore a dress she and Martha Briggs had spent 2 weeks making from fabric purchased in Coldwater, a soft green calico that Martha said made her eyes look remarkable, which Anna said was generous, and Martha said was accurate. When the pastor said the words and Roscoe put the plain silver ring on her finger and said, "With this ring I thee wed," in a voice that was quiet and steady and meant every syllable, Anna Bailey, who was now Anna Vaughn, felt the full weight of the last 5 years lift from her all at once. The walking and the hunger and the fear and the loneliness and all the things she had managed to survive. And she felt in its place something she had almost stopped believing was real, which was permanence, which was belonging to a place and a person and a life. She looked at him, and he was looking at her with those gray eyes full of the most careful and complete and sincere feeling. And she thought, "This is the man who got up early and sat on a hay bale in the dark just to understand the shape of my difficulty. And this is the man who said come and eat in the simplest possible way and meant it. And this is the man I will grow old next to on this plain with the great sky above us, and I am not afraid of any of it." She kissed him while the pastor was still finishing the last sentence, and everyone laughed, and he laughed too, surprised and pleased, and pulled her closer. And the April wind moved through the wildflowers on the fence posts, and Scout nickered from the corral, as if he too had an opinion about the proceedings. They settled into their life with a naturalness that would have surprised them both if they had been the type to be surprised by good things, which they were both learning to be. The ranch grew. She planted her kitchen garden, and it produced with the enthusiasm of good soil given proper attention, the beans especially, climbing their poles with an ambition that made her proud. The tomatoes, contrary to the clerk's pessimism, came in beautifully in August, and she made preserves from them that she stacked on the kitchen shelf in a row of gleaming jars. Roscoe expanded the cattle operation that summer, buying 12 head from a rancher down near the Texas line who was liquidating, riding down with a hired man he had taken on for the season, a young man named Pete Fulton who was 17 and from Arkansas and who worked hard and said almost nothing, and clearly regarded Roscoe as an authority figure he would have died rather than disappoint. Pete stayed through the fall and into the next year and became something like a fixture, and Anna fed him at their table without question, and noticed that the boy was eating like someone who had not always had enough, which she understood entirely and did not comment on. She discovered in July that she was expecting. She told Roscoe on an evening in mid-July when the heat sat on the prairie like a warm hand, and they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the sky darken toward night. She had not worked out a speech. She simply looked at him and said it. He went very still for a moment, the way he did when something important was happening. Then he turned to look at her. "Anna," he said. "I know," she said. "I am well. I feel very well. You are certain?" "Fairly certain, yes." He reached out and took her hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture so tender and uncharacteristic of his usual quiet restraint that she felt the tears come before she had any intention of crying. And he saw them and put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the warm July dusk with the fireflies beginning to rise from the grass the way she had described to him once, like sparks shaken from a fire. "Thomas," she said. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him Thomas." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." Thomas Henry Vaughn was born in March of 1880, in the same house where his parents had eaten their first meal together, in the bed where his father had spent 3 winters alone before a woman came out of the pre-dawn dark and changed everything. He was a loud, determined, dark-haired infant who arrived with a full set of opinions and the general disposition of someone who has been looking forward to this and sees no reason to waste time. Martha Briggs served as midwife and pronounced him perfect with the authority of a woman who had seen a great many babies and knew what she was talking about. Roscoe, who had remained outside the door because Martha had suggested this and because he was not sure his nerves could manage otherwise, came in when she called him and stood by the bed and looked at his wife and his son for a long time without saying anything. "Well," he said finally. "Well," Anna agreed from the bed, exhausted and radiant. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Thomas, who was investigating the general situation with the nearsighted concentration of the newborn, and something crossed Roscoe Vaughn's face that had no name except the one you call it when a man who has been alone for a long time and has guarded himself carefully from hope finds that hope was right all along. "Hello," he said to his son, quietly, as if they were being introduced. "I am your father." Thomas considered this information and then sneezed. "He is not impressed," Anna said. "He will be," Roscoe said, and she heard everything in those 2 words and smiled. The years that came after were good years, not without hardship, because the land demanded its dues in bad weather and difficult seasons, and the occasional setbacks that came with ranching, but good in the deep sense, the kind of good that you only recognize from the inside of it, where you know that whatever comes, you are facing it alongside someone whose presence is not a comfort you are hoping to keep but a permanence you have built. In the spring of 1881, they had a drought that turned the creek bed dry for 6 weeks and cost them 3 head of cattle, and they managed it. The winter of 1882 was brutal in a way that reminded Anna of her first winter in Kansas. But this time she was on the right side of the walls, and there were warm bodies and warm food, and the sound of Thomas learning to walk in the main room, and the complete impossibility of being afraid of a blizzard, when a 14-month-old was using the kitchen chair as a walking aid, and congratulating himself loudly on every step. Pete Fulton stayed on at the ranch and proved himself invaluable and grew from a cautious, quiet 17-year-old into a steady and capable young man of 20 whom Roscoe trusted completely, and Anna had long since decided was something like a younger brother. He had attached himself to the Vaughn spread with the faithful permanence of someone who recognized a good thing and was smart enough to honor it. And in the spring of 1882, he came to supper one evening slightly more nervous than usual and announced, with considerable clearing of his throat, that he had met a young woman in Coldwater whose name was June, and that she was the daughter of the hardware merchant, and that he would very much like to know what they thought about the prospect of him marrying her. "What do you think about the prospect of you marrying her?" Roscoe said. Pete went red. "I think I would like to very much, sir." "Then that is the opinion that matters," Roscoe said. Anna looked at her husband across the table with affection so clear and comfortable it was almost like a color in the room, and he met her eyes with that slight deepening of his expression that was his version of a whole paragraph. Pete married June in the summer of 1882, a cheerful, energetic wedding at the church in Coldwater that Anna attended heavily pregnant with their second child. Roscoe stood as witness for Pete with the particular composure of a man who understood what he was witnessing and honored it fully. June was a bright and capable woman who had grown up in a town and had opinions about coming out to ranch land that she expressed with disarming honesty, and then proceeded to act on by immediately learning everything she could about the work involved. Their second child was a boy, Daniel James Vaughn, born in August of 1882, named for the Book of Daniel, which Anna had always loved, and for Roscoe's brother James, who received the news by letter and responded with 5 pages of enthusiastic congratulations and a tentative suggestion that he might come west to meet his nephews, which Roscoe wrote back to say would be more than welcome. Thomas, who was 2.5 when Daniel arrived, regarded his new brother with initial suspicion and eventual acceptance, the acceptance accelerating considerably once Daniel became old enough to be played with rather than simply observed. James Vaughn came west in the fall of 1882, arriving on the stage in Coldwater on a Thursday afternoon, and Roscoe drove in to meet him and came back with a man who was clearly his brother in the way that certain people are unmistakably their siblings. The same build, the same careful economy of movement. Though James talked considerably more and laughed more readily, and had been married for 12 years to a woman named Ruth who had not come, but sent detailed regards, and a recipe for corn bread that she vouched was superior to any other in existence. James stayed 2 weeks, and in that 2 weeks he ate Anna's food and played with his nephews and rode out with Roscoe every day, and in the evening sat at the kitchen table and talked with an ease that made the house feel like it had expanded. On his last evening, sitting out on the porch in the cool fall air with the sound of the boys asleep inside, he said to Anna, "You are the best thing that could have happened to him." "He is the best thing that could have happened to me," she said simply, and meant it in the full and precise way of someone saying a true thing. "I believe you both," James said, with a warmth that was a Vaughn characteristic expressed at twice the typical Roscoe volume. The ranch kept growing, modestly but steadily. Roscoe added to the cattle herd each year, and by 1884 they were running 40 head, a proper operation requiring 2 hired hands in addition to Pete, who had taken on something like a foreman's role. Anna managed the household accounts with a precision that Roscoe trusted entirely, and that allowed him to focus on the land work he was good at. She had also become, by a process of organic community building that she had not particularly planned, one of the people in the area that other women came to when they needed advice or practical help, Martha Briggs having cheerfully pressed her into service after Anna demonstrated competence in approximately everything she attempted. She helped 3 women through difficult childbirths. She taught reading to the children of 2 families who were too remote for the town school. She organized a rotating supply system among the outlying homesteads for the hard winter months, a practical network of mutual aid that solved a problem everyone had been coping with individually, and that worked because Anna understood logistics, and also because she had learned from the inside what it meant to be alone and hungry, and how much the smallest gesture of practical generosity could matter. She had also written a long letter to a women's charitable organization in Kansas City about the conditions facing women who arrived in the territory without resources or family, describing with clear-eyed precision what the experience was like and what kinds of support could actually help. It was a letter written from experience rather than observation, and it had a specificity and moral authority that the organization apparently found compelling, because they wrote back with interest and then wrote back again, and a correspondence began that led, by 1885, to the establishment of a small but functional network of safe houses along the major wagon roads through the territory, run by volunteer families who agreed to provide shelter and food to women in transit. Roscoe, who had always known what she was capable of, was not surprised by any of this. He was simply, consistently, completely in support of it, which included more than once rearranging his own schedule to accommodate hers, and which occasionally included sitting across the table from her in the evenings, while she wrote correspondence and handing her the ink when she needed it and reading her drafts when she asked and saying, when what she had written was good, that it was good, and when it needed sharpening. Saying that too in a way that was so clearly in service of her work, and not his opinion of it that she accepted his feedback with a readiness she had never managed with anyone else. In the spring of 1885, Anna found herself sitting on the porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee, watching Thomas, who was 5 now, attempt to teach Daniel, who was 2, the proper way to approach Scout. Scout was 17 now and gray around the muzzle, and moved with the dignified patience of an old horse who has seen everything twice and found most of it agreeable. He lowered his great head to Thomas's level with an indulgence that confirmed Anna's long-held sense that Scout had excellent judgment. Roscoe came out and sat beside her with his own coffee, and they watched the boys and the old horse together in the morning light. "I have been thinking," she said. "What about?" he said. She looked at the ranch, the house and the barn and the corral and the kitchen garden and the fence lines and the wide, open, enormous Kansas sky above all of it. She thought about the soddy a quarter-mile north, which Roscoe had used as a storage shed since the year after they married, the north wall reinforced, the floor properly set. She thought about a gray November morning in 1878, and a woman so hungry her hands were trembling, and a horse with liquid, intelligent eyes who had nickered a greeting and changed the course of everything. "About how far we have come," she said, "from where we both started." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas was telling Daniel something very important about the horse's ear placement as it related to his mood, with the confidence of a 5-year-old authority. "I have been thinking the same thing," he said. "Were you afraid," she said, "that morning in the barn when you said my name?" He looked at her. "Terrified," he said without hesitation. "I had not let myself care about anything that much in 2 years, and there you were in the dark, not taking the oats you needed because you had more principles than sense." "I had sense enough," she said. "You had enough of everything," he said. He reached over and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 6 years now, with the ease and completeness of something that had become as natural as breathing. "You walked across this country alone and kept yourself alive and kept your integrity intact, and then you sat in my kitchen on the first morning and held yourself so straight and said I am not a thief as if you were testifying before a court. I think I loved you slightly from that moment." She looked at him. "Slightly," she said. "Well," he said, "it accelerated." She laughed, and he smiled, and Thomas looked over from Scout's fence with the tolerant expression of a 5-year-old whose parents were being strange again. And Daniel, not wanting to miss whatever was happening, toddled over and climbed up onto the porch and wedged himself firmly between them on the bench, which left very little room but which neither of them suggested correcting. They sat there in the morning, the 4 of them, with the spring light coming gold and wide across the Kansas plain, and Scout watching them from the corral with his dark eyes full of patient intelligence. And the sky above was so large and so clear that it seemed like it was meant to hold everything at once. Every hard year and every good meal, and every morning when a woman had walked through the frost-stiff grass to care for someone else's horse without being asked, and every morning after that. All of them building forward into something solid and true. In the fall of that year, 1885, a woman came to the door of the Vaughn ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. She was young, perhaps 20, and she had walked a long way and was thin in the particular way that Anna recognized immediately, the drawn face and the careful posture and the eyes that were measuring the situation for the location of every exit. Anna opened the door and looked at her. "Come in," she said, without preamble. I have biscuits on and there is hot coffee." The young woman looked at her. She had dark eyes and red-chapped hands, and she was holding a small canvas sack. And something in her expression when she looked at the house, and then at Anna, was the very particular expression of someone who has been surviving on the outside for long enough that the sight of an open door and warmth, and a woman who simply says come in without a list of conditions attached, is almost more than they know what to do with. "I am not a thief," the young woman said. Anna smiled, and it was a full smile, knowing and warm and absolutely certain. "I know," she said. "Come in." Her name was Mary Ellis, and she had come from Springfield, Missouri, by wagon and then by foot. And her story had the particular contours that Anna knew from the inside, not identical but rhyming, the same shape of loss and determination, and the same refusal to stop moving forward, even when forward was not a direction so much as a stubborn habit. Anna fed her and listened to her and gave her the tack room for the night, which had not been the tack room since 1879, but was now a proper small guest room, warm and dry with a bolt on the inside, because Anna had insisted on that when they fixed it up. Roscoe came in from the fields and met Mary Ellis at the supper table and said how do you do and helped himself to the stew and asked her where she was headed with the same level, unhurried attention he gave everything, and Anna watched him from across the table and thought, this is who he is, this plain-spoken, decent, careful man who fed a stranger without making it a test of character for either of them. Mary stayed 3 days. Before she left, Anna wrote her a letter of introduction to a family in the Safe House Network 2 days' ride south, who would continue the chain of practical support until she reached her intended destination, which was a teaching post in a new school being established in the Cherokee Strip. Mary Ellis shook Anna's hand and then, unexpectedly, embraced her, briefly but with complete sincerity. "Thank you," she said. "You would have managed," Anna said, "but I am glad you did not have to." After Mary had gone, Roscoe found Anna standing at the kitchen window watching the road. He came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him. "I keep thinking about all the women who did not find a barn to tend," she said. "All the ones who did not stumble across someone who asked them in. I was so lucky." "You were not only lucky," he said. "You were also the person who was willing to keep going until you found the place worth stopping." She turned to face him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading for nearly 7 years now, that she could read the way she read the land and the weather and the 1,000 small signs of a life shared long enough to become fluent in another person. "I stopped here," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did." He kissed her in the kitchen, with the October light coming through the window they had resealed together that first November. And outside Thomas was yelling something at Pete about the proper way to coil a rope, and Daniel was conducting a serious investigation of a beetle in the yard, and Scout stood in the corral in his old horse's patience, and the sky above the Vaughn ranch was the deep clear blue of a Kansas autumn, going on forever in every direction. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because life on the Kansas plains was never fully tame and never fully predictable, and the world that Anna and Roscoe lived in was one of constant negotiation between what you hoped for and what was actually there. The cattle market had its hard years. There were seasons of drought and one summer of terrible storms that took the chicken coop clean off its foundation and damaged the north fence line significantly. Thomas, at 7, broke his arm falling from Scout's fence and healed cleanly, but scared his parents considerably in the interim. Daniel, at 4, got into the medicine cabinet and created a situation that required the doctor from Coldwater to ride out at speed, which he did, arriving to find a very small boy with an impressive stomachache, but no permanent damage, which the doctor attributed to the boy's evident constitution and the quality of Anna Vaughn's response to the emergency. Pete and June had their first child in 1884, a boy they named Robert, and their second in 1886, a girl named Clara, which made Anna look at Roscoe with a question in her eyes, and he shook his head very slightly with a look that said simply, "He chose well, and it is all right. It is more than all right," and she understood. The railroad came closer in 1885, and the cattle market improved, and by 1887, the Vaughn Ranch was running 60 head with 3 permanent hired hands and was considered one of the more successful operations in Comanche County. Not the largest, but consistently well managed, which people in the county attributed to Roscoe's steady judgment, and which those people would have attributed equally to Anna's if they had seen the ledger books and the supply networks and the quiet organizational intelligence she brought to everything she touched. In the winter of 1887, Anna received a letter from the Kansas City Women's Organization she had been corresponding with for 3 years. It was a formal letter, somewhat ceremonious in its opening, and it informed her that the network of safe houses she had helped establish was now formally incorporated as a charitable organization, and that the board of directors would be honored if she would serve as a founding member. She read the letter at the kitchen table while Roscoe was outside with the hands, and Thomas was doing his reading lessons by the stove, and Daniel was allegedly napping in the back room, the nap being frequently theoretical in Daniel's case. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the room around her, the warm kitchen and the shelf of preserves and the window that faced east and showed her the winter sky. And she thought about a woman who had arrived at this ranch 7 years ago with $4.30 sewn into her boot lining, and a stubbornness that had been the only thing standing between her and disappearing entirely into the vast indifferent plains. Roscoe came in at noon, and she handed him the letter. He read it. He put it down. "Well," he said, "I want to accept," she said. "Of course you do," he said, "and of course you should. It will mean some travel, some meetings in Kansas City." "I know what boards of directors do, Anna," he said, and there was the dry precision of his humor in it, and she felt it land the way it always did. "Pete can manage things here. I managed this place alone for 3 years before you arrived, and I have learned considerably more since then." "You were terrible at the accounts," she said. "I remain terrible at the accounts," he said, entirely undefended. "Which is why you handle them, and which will continue to be the case regardless of how many trips to Kansas City you make." She looked at him. He was helping himself to coffee with the unhurried ease of a man in his own kitchen, in his own life, in a life that was exactly what he had built it to be, and she was in it, present and complete and woven through every part of it in the way of someone who belongs not just to a place but to a person. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said things to him, directly and without preamble, because she had learned that with him directness was the highest form of tenderness. He looked over his shoulder at her. "I know," he said, and then, with the small deepening of expression that was his version of everything, "I love you too." She accepted the board position. She made 3 trips to Kansas City in 1888 and 2 in 1889. Traveling on the train that now ran through to Dodge City from the east and taking a connecting stage. And each time she came back she brought the boys small things. Books for Thomas and toy soldiers for Daniel, who was going through an intense military phase that no one had quite explained to Roscoe's satisfaction. And she sat at the kitchen table with Roscoe on the first night back and told him everything that had happened, and he listened with his full attention and asked the questions that showed he had been paying attention the whole time. Thomas, by the time he was 10, was clearly going to be a reader and a thinker, more interested in the books his mother brought home than in the cattle work, though he was competent at the cattle work and took it seriously because it was serious. He had Anna's directness and Roscoe's patience, and a combination of both their senses of humor that occasionally produced observations of such precise unexpected comedy that it stopped entire meals. Daniel, at 7, was pure forward momentum, interested in everything that moved or could be made to move, partial to horses and to Pete's company, and to taking things apart to see how they worked, which had produced mixed results depending on the value of the thing taken apart. He had Roscoe's gray eyes and Anna's dark hair, and her exact expression of focused determination when he was working on something, which Roscoe found moving in a way he did not feel the need to articulate. In the spring of 1889, they planted the kitchen garden again, as they did every spring, and this year Thomas and Daniel helped with genuine usefulness rather than the decorative involvement of earlier years. It was a Saturday morning in April, and the soil was warm under their hands, and the sky was that specific Kansas spring blue, and Anna was on her knees by the bean row showing Daniel the proper depth for the seeds, and Thomas was working the next row with a concentration that would have looked like Roscoe's if you had seen them side by side. And Roscoe stood at the edge of the garden with his coffee and looked at his family in the spring light. He had stood in the barn in the dark on a November morning 11 years ago and watched a woman feed his horse with careful hands, and he had made a decision, a simple and irreversible one, which was that he was going to ask her to come in out of the cold. He had not known then what it would become, could not have known, could only have felt the shape of the necessity, the way you feel a thing before you understand it. He knew now. He knew it in the full, specific, unhurried way of someone who has had years to understand something and has used them well. Anna looked up from the bean row and found him watching her, and she knew that expression on his face by now the way she knew his footstep and his handwriting and the exact temperature of his coffee preference. She knew what it meant. She met his eyes and let him see that she knew, and that she felt the same, and that neither of them needed to say any of it because they had been saying it for years in every practical and unpractical way available to two people who had both once been very much alone and were now, completely and permanently, and by every measure that mattered not. Scout died in the summer of 1889, peacefully in his stall, at an age that the veterinarian who came out from Coldwater calculated at somewhere between 22 and 24 years, which he said was a remarkable run for any horse. Thomas cried sincerely, because Thomas had grown up with Scout's patient face at the fence and his soft nickering and his dark knowing eyes. Daniel did not cry but was unusually quiet for 2 days, which in Daniel was the equivalent. Roscoe buried him in the south corner of the corral where he had always liked to stand in the morning sun, and Anna stood beside him and did not say anything because there was nothing to say except what they both already knew, which was that Scout had been there from the beginning and that was worth honoring. They got a new horse in the fall, a young bay mare that the boys immediately named Duchess, against Roscoe's mild suggestion that they consider a simpler name, and Duchess turned out to have Scout's quality of patient intelligence, which Anna thought was not a coincidence, and which Roscoe called coincidence but treated as if it were not. In the years that followed, the ranch and the family continued to grow and change in the ways of living things that are well tended. The Safe House Network became a properly funded organization, and Anna served on its board for 8 years and helped it expand to cover more of the territory, and eventually to advocate before the territorial legislature for specific protections for women traveling alone. A fight that was slow and partial in its victories, but that moved forward because Anna Bailey Vaughn was the kind of person who kept pushing with a steadiness that simply outlasted resistance. Thomas, when he was 17, announced that he wanted to go to university. Roscoe and Anna sat with this for an evening and then told him yes, they would find the way to make it happen, which they did. He went east to Lawrence, to the University of Kansas, which had been admitting students since 1866, and he wrote long, detailed letters home that Anna read at the kitchen table with a pride so complete it was physical. He came back in the summers and worked the ranch and grew into a young man of considered intelligence and essential decency, who seemed to have inherited the best of both his parents, and who had a gift for explaining complicated things clearly that led him eventually toward law. Daniel, at 16, declared his intention to stay with the land and specifically with the horses, which surprised no one. He became, over time, one of the better horse trainers in that part of Kansas, with a reputation that came from his combination of patience and instinct, and the complete lack of ego that the best animal handlers share, the willingness to let the animal set the pace. By the time Anna was 40 and Roscoe was 47, they had been on the land together for 16 years, and the ranch had become what it was always going to be if two determined and complementary people gave it their full lives, which was something solid enough to be passed on. The house had been expanded twice. The barn was a proper structure now with good timber and a loft full of hay for the hard months. The kitchen garden had expanded to a full vegetable garden, and then to an orchard, 3 apple trees and 2 pear trees along the south wall, planted in the optimistic faith that they would take root, and that Anna and Roscoe would live long enough to eat their fruit, which they did. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the season allowed, as they had been doing since the first winter, and they watched the light change over the Kansas plain with the particular appreciation of people who have looked at the same view long enough to know all its moods. The sky was still enormous. The land was still flat and wide and demanding and beautiful in that particular way of places that ask everything of you and give everything back. "Do you remember the first morning," she said, "on an evening in the summer of 1894, not for the first time? They return to it sometimes, the way you return to the beginning of a story because the beginning contains everything that came after. Every detail," he said. "You sat on a hay bale in the dark for 2 hours," she said. 1 hour and 40 minutes, he corrected. "I had a watch." She shook her head. "And you said morning as if it were the most ordinary thing." "It seemed like the thing most likely to work," he said. "It did work." "Yes," he said. He turned to look at her in the evening light, this woman who had walked into his barn out of the cold and dark and had never truly left, who had become so completely the organizing fact of his life that he could not have said any more where his history ended and hers began. "It worked rather well, I think." She took his hand. Outside, the last light was going from the prairie, the sky going from gold to rose to the deep blue that preceded the stars, and somewhere behind the house Daniel was talking to Duchess in the easy, low voice he used with horses, and from the distance came the sound of Pete Fulton's supper bell at the foreman's cabin, and somewhere a meadowlark was giving the plains its last opinion of the day. "Roscoe," she said. "Anna," he said. She looked at the sky. She looked at the land. She looked at the man beside her, the one who had waited in the dark and called her in from the cold and meant every simple word of it. "This is the life I wanted," she said. "This is exactly it." He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles the same way he had on that July evening by the porch when she told him she was expecting Thomas, that gesture that had undone her the first time and that still did, because with him nothing that was real had ever become merely routine. "Me too," he said, with the complete, unhurried certainty of a man who has arrived at the exact place he was meant to be and has had 16 years to be sure of it. "Me too." The stars came out over Kansas, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, filling the enormous sky above the ranch where two people who might have missed each other entirely, who had both been alone long enough to understand what it meant not to be, sat together in the warm dark of a summer evening, held by the land they had made into a home, and the life they had made into something worth every cold mile that had led them here.